Okay. Good afternoon, comrades. This report will include a number of points. I will try to go as fast as I can so I can cover all of them. First of all, I have to say that the way to obtain information about the war and the contender countries is very difficult because there is an excess of information on both sides, and a big chunk of that is just propaganda. So it's very difficult to separate what is true from what is not true. Somebody has a background noise.
Está Patty, está viendo una telenovela.
Okay. So it's very difficult to, it's very easy to get information. It's very hard to determine what information is confirmed and is true and is not true, because both sides, Russia on its own and NATO and in the United States control most of the media. So it's very difficult to determine what is actually true and what is not. There are some things that we can discern and apply logic to events, but that's all what we can do. One of the things that I need to underline before I start getting into the new events that happens in the war is that I made several mistakes in my characterization together with most of the world, of course. I thought when the war started that Russia was in a position to win it very fast in a few weeks, and they have overwhelming superiority. They have air superiority, marine, sea superiority, and of course, they have a much larger and powerful country than Ukraine. Well, I made a mistake. I think that I underestimate two things. One is the professionalism in which the Ukrainian armed forces were trained by NATO, armed by NATO and the United States, and the experience they acquire in the previous 7 years when they have this civil war between them and the separatists in the eastern part of the country. So what it was looking like a walk in the park for Russia becomes an entanglement. This is also, we have to stress, the incompetence of the Russian military, because they actually made some very stupid mistakes, like blocking all the tanks in one-way road in the entrance of Kyiv and exposing them to attack by the Ukrainian infantry. Then when the Ukrainians say we are going to do our counteroffensive, announce a counteroffensive in the southern east of the country, they rushed to reinforce that, taking troops from the north, and then the main counteroffensive of the Ukrainian was in the north, and they get into the trap. So here we have a counterpoise, a very able, well-led, smaller army against a bigger, incompetent-led army of the Russians. The second thing is that I made a mistake is that I thought that the weapons promised from the West, from the United States and NATO, will take longer period of time to reach the front lines, and it was a short. So if that enabled the Ukrainians to actually mount a very energetic, well-armed, disciplined, competent defense. Of course, there are several stories about this. They are also exaggeration, because the Ukrainians say, well, we killed already 50,000 Russians. First day, 14,000, then 20,000, then 25,000, now 50,000. The Russians recognize that they got about 6,000 killed. The truth probably around 10,000 or 12,000 Russian troops killed, but the Ukrainians don't say how many of theirs are killed, and probably a equal number or even bigger than the Russians. So these are the difficulty to reach a complete characterization. So the Russian first went to Kiev, the capital, and tried to take it over. At the same time, they advanced a little bit in the eastern part of the country, the southeast, and took the city of Kherson. But then when they couldn't take Kiev, they withdraw from there, went through a number of hundreds of miles to reinforce the eastern part of the Ukraine and launch an offensive from there. And there they advance. They advance and they occupy around 22-23% of the eastern part of the country. The counteroffensive of the Ukrainians that shall happen retook about 4 or 5% of that 25%. So the Russians still control about 25%. Now, we have to talk about some other stuff. After Russia started its invasion of Ukraine on February 24, at least 8 million refugees fled Ukraine and scattered across Europe, but essentially in Poland, while another 8 million people were estimated were internally displaced between the country. And more than 2 million people went as refugees to Russia. So that is a grand total of about 18, 19 million people, which is close to half of the population of Ukraine, which is about 42, 43 million before the war. This displacement, internal displacement, went both sides. Before the war, it was a displacement of Russian speaking Ukrainian from the west to the east, because they were being persecuted by the Ukrainian that took over the country and established a anti-Russian government in 2014. So there were displacement of people from west to east, looking for joining the areas in which we have more Russian-speaking population and the protection of Russia. Then after the war started, it was a displacement of people from the east to the west, and from the west to the east. From the west to the east, more people Russian-speaking or supporter of Russia started going east, and a lot of people who supported Ukraine or the Ukrainian government went from the east to the west. At the same time, we have these 8 million people going across the border. Who are they? And why they fled the country in the middle of a war? According to what we can see in the videos and the movies and some scattered reports, many people who went across the border into Poland and other countries are old people, but also there were the numbers, tens of thousands of people who were at the age of being able to serve in the army, and they were refusing to do so. So they left the country. That forced the Ukrainian government, by the way, to establish a prohibition of to travel for men 18 to 60 years old. But in spite of it, young people are still going out of the country. Why they do that? Because they are afraid, because they are against the war, because they support Russia, maybe a combination of all these reasons. So it's very difficult to determine what these people are. But one thing is certain is we cannot consider them as a bloc. They didn't go out of the country just for one reason, but a combination of many. Fear, support for Russia, because they are pacifists or whatever. The character of the war is one of an imperialist war between two blocs. One by Russia, supported by China and other countries that are allied, and the other bloc is NATO and the United States, who utilizes the Ukrainian army as their own. They arm, they train, they pay their wages and so on, in order to have a proxy army to fight against Russia. Why they are fighting? Well, if you look at the speech yesterday that Putin, in which Putin expressed a very long position about the war and why, and Russia, and why they are doing what they're doing at the ceremony in which they annexed 4 regions in. He said because energy, food, and space, land. And we can say that the same reasons have the West to attack Russia. Food, energy, but also because there is another issue that confront each other. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO was looking to expand east. As a matter of fact, was successfully recruiting for NATO several countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union or they were satellites of the Soviet Union. Russia see this movement to the east from NATO as a danger for the border. And as I always wanted, imperialist countries trying to do, they try to formalize a no war zone between the Western powers and Russia in order to have a barrier for a direct confrontation with Western Europe. So they make an agreement with NATO that NATO already expanded a lot and they wouldn't expand it anymore. But then Ukraine trying to join NATO and the European Union, and Russia saw that as a problem, as a threatening move, because they will be troops from the NATO will be at the doors of Russia. And NATO and United States want that to happen, want to have troops near the border with Russia. So that's another element in which both sides are clashing on. But now we have a new stage of the war. After the retreat from Kiev and after they suffered several defeats, the Russians changed their strategy. They advanced from the east. They sustained a counteroffensive from Ukraine, and now they devise another strategy. They annexed the four regions in which they have advanced during the last stage of the war. That is Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. That added to Crimea that they annexed in 2014, give Russia the entire eastern side of the country. Yesterday, after a vote was taken in all these regions, 4 regions, that the Western press is saying that it was a shameful election that doesn't represent anything, that it was all commanded by the Russians. After a vote in which 90, 92, 93% of the population is said to have voted in favor of joining the Russian Federation, Putin had a ceremony yesterday in which they accepted the result of the election and accepted and declared that they will annex, or they are annexing, these 4 regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which added Crimea that was annexed before. It was a big rally outside the Kremlin supporting Putin and this new strategy. And he said that the people in this area are Russian forever, that they will never abandon, and that any attack against them, it will be an attack against the Russian Federation, not against a separatist region as before, but now it will be considered an attack on Russian territory. They will take a while this to be official, because the parliament, they have to approve this, which is discounted that they will, because Putin controlled the establishment, the parliament very closely. So once that is done, Russia will have the excuse to consider any attack against them as an attack against Russia, and then maybe will consider some of the countries who are helping the Ukrainians, armed Ukrainian as forces combatant in the war, and could call for a full mobilization of the Russian people, because they will declare war against Russia, which was not the case until now. This, of course, opened up a number of new scenarios. Unfortunately for Putin, the day after he gave this speech, the Russian troops had to abandon Liman, a town in the border of one of the zones. Russia has declared mobilization of those who are able combatants and that have some experience before. It is not a full mobilization that was ordered in Russia. It was just a mobilization of those who have certain experience, military experience and training served in other wars, or in other circumstances, and more or less, these people amount to about 300,000. Immediately after it was declared a mobilization, it was a rallies against the war and rallies against the order of mobilization. It's very hard to determine how many people were at this rally. My own estimate is that they were big or relatively big in St. Petersburg and in some other cities, but they are in most of the country, they were small. They were about, and I can judge that they were kind of big because they detained around 1,500, 1,800 people. To arrest 1,800 people, it should be many more participating in those rallies. However, it was massive arrest, and it also put forward, with the help of the parliament, a change in the law, opposing the law, the war, or demonstrating against the war, now carry penalties from 1 to 10 years in jail. And if you're a deserter, it's 10 years right away. If you refuse to be drafted, it's 10 years jail as well. So they are continuing. As expected, some of the people try to flee the country to avoid being recruited, either because they oppose the war or because they are pacifists, or because ideologically in opposition to Putin, or because they have family in Ukraine. For a number of reasons, there are people who don't want to be mobilized into the army to go fight Ukraine. So some of these people will tend to try to leave the country. Now, the main problem to judge how many, the media in the West is taking pictures and showing videos of a long caravan of cars and trucks leaving Russia into Finland. And it's true, there's a lot of people going one-way direction from Russia to Finland. But we should consider that it's the only road open, and that you cannot use an airplane because half of the airlines do not fly to Russia because the sanctions, and the other half have been booked even before the declaration of mobilization. There are very few planes leaving Russia. So people who wants to leave Russia have to go mostly on the road, and you have two ways to do it. One passage in Norway, in the Arctic Norway, and one road into Finland. So even though there are people leaving because they are resisting, I think the media in the West has exaggerated the number, even though it could be important. What is the degree of the opposition to the war in Russia and in Ukraine? And this is a very important thing to clarify, because it is our position to be against the war in both countries. So let's utilize the logic. In Ukraine, it was established a police state. There's a law that do not allow you to circulate after certain hours of the day, the state of siege, military rule is controlling the traffic, both pedestrian and the automobiles. Thousands of people have been arrested utilizing laws recently enacted, saying that if you're against the war, you are essentially guilty of treason. So they are arresting people for either treason or because they were Russian speaking and potentially spies. So they arrested thousands of people. They break into their houses, they arrest them, and for the most part, nobody knows where they are, where they have been arrested and held. In Russia, it's the same thing. If you're against there are new laws that if you're against the war, you have to suffer penalty. You are arrested for making a mobilization against the war. And in both countries, in Ukraine also, most of the opposition parties have been suspended, some of them prohibited. Mostly the pro-Russian parties. Remember that Ukraine was at one time led by a pro-Russian president supported by 3 or 4 pro-Russian political parties that exist in Ukraine that won the election many years ago, or some years ago, like a decade ago. And also they suspended and prohibited the activity of most of what they call the left parties. So there is essentially a prohibition to demonstrate against the war in Ukraine. Political parties are prohibited. In Russia, if you demonstrate against the war, you are repressed. And if you participate in an organization that promote being against the war, then you may be accused of being a traitor. So both states are fast transforming themselves into police state in order to defend their position in the war. My guess, because there's no way that we can have objective data, is that part of the people who leave Russia now and part of the people who leave Ukraine now are against the war in both sides. They are either pacifists or they have ideological position of being against the war. And some of them, including some of them, that think that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. There is a number of people who believe that in both countries, or that have relatives in the other countries. There are many Ukrainians who have relatives in Russia and many Russians who have relatives in Ukraine. That is why, or what explains, that this opposition to the war in part explain the exodus from Russia, but also the exodus to other countries from Ukraine. And if you look at the newspaper, you see that there were some demonstrations in favor of Ukraine and NATO in Western Europe, and a small one, I believe, here by Ukrainian residents in different countries, plus some political parties that demonstrated, including some left parties who support Ukraine in the war. But they were generally few and not that big. And in the United States, the anti-war movement is missing in action. It doesn't exist. It's like we all approve the war, which is not true, but it seems that there's no opposition. There is no opposition in Congress to the war. Congress is rarely rarely an occasion in which the Democrats and Republicans agree so much on an issue than the war in Ukraine. But in Europe, are starting to be some problems. Those supporting Russia and Finland, for example, supported a movement to force the prime minister to resign because some videos appeared from a party that the prime minister participated. Apparently, they were singing and youth exposure and so on in the party. So they promote that video and force the prime minister of Finland, who was very strong on the side of Ukraine, to resign. And behind that, there are some forces in Finland who were not in favor of Ukraine and not in favor of the war. In Italy, as you know, a couple of days ago, the neo-fascists won the election. The prime minister that was elected, a woman, belonged to the Fratelli of Italia, which is a neo-fascist ultra right wing, said the newspapers in the West, who are not in favor of the war for different reasons than we are. They are against the war because they say if the war is declared, we're risking a generalized war that will put they will risk Italia, they will force Italian maybe to go and fight. So there is not very much opposition to the war. There is some visible in the street in a number of countries, but it's very small. Okay. Another issue that has been talked in the media is the problem of the nuclear danger. And it's some basis for this. One basis is that Putin made kind of a diffuse declaration in which he may imply that he can use all the resources in his power to win this war. And that will include tactical nuclear bombs. But it's also some of the leaders in the eastern side of Ukraine, who are now part of Russia officially, that they indicate that they will favorable to the use of tactical nuclear weapons against the advancing Ukrainian troops. So it's very certain. There have been shootings of artillery from both sides in areas where there are nuclear plants that also risk the possibility that one of those nuclear plants being blown up. So there's a real danger. And if Russia, even though now it's annexed 5 regions in Ukraine, continue to be having, and in spite of the fact that they are mobilizing 300,000 more troops, and probably later they will mobilize more, they cannot stabilize the situation in Ukraine with the area they control. They may be tempted to use a tactical weapon, nuclear weapon. And if they do, what the reply of the Western powers will be? That is a very serious risk. We didn't have this risk in the world since the Cuban crisis. Remember the missile Cuban crisis? We were very close there. Well, we are closer now because we are in the heart of Europe and we are face to face with, nuclear powers on both sides. So are we going to see an end of this war negotiations? they are difficult because Putin has said these are now Russian territories, these are now Russian citizens, and therefore we are not going to give back any part of Russia to obtain a peace with the renegades people in Ukraine. And Zelensky has said, and some of his ministers have said, that they are against any negotiation with Putin, and they are against any, because nothing can be achieved with Putin, and they will wait for the next president to be elected somehow, sometimes in the future in Russia, and they will never agree to a peace agreement until the Russians completely withdraw, not only from the 4 regions that they just annexed, but also from Crimea itself, something that is impossible for Russia to accede. So negotiations are pretty distant, unless there's something that I don't know that could be possible to reinstate the negotiation. Apparently, we won't see them for a period of time. The other solution is that, or end of the war, is that Russia will force the Ukrainian armed forces to retreat. That they will, send reinforcement, they will push the Ukrainians back, and they will stabilize the control of the 5 area regions that now they control Ukraine. But will this be sufficient to stop the war? It's difficult to know, but my guess is that part of the armed forces in Ukraine that are controlled by the right wing and by nationalists will refuse to accept this, and they will continue one way or another with the war as it was before, before this, between Kiev and the separate state from after 2014. The other possibility to end the war is the complete defeat of the Russian and Ukrainians, and that they will, through the towel, as they say, into the ring and say, well, we are withdrawing. This is the end of it. As they did, for example, in Afghanistan, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, one day they say, we are not taking this anymore. We're living and lick our wounds. It's possible. It will depend on the degree of the help from the Western powers to the Ukrainian, the increase in the number of foreign fighters on the side of the Ukrainians. But it's possible, but very far from reality. I mean, it's possible, but not very possible. So we are having here something like a conundrum, because the only open way for the war to stop will be if we have apparently, because negotiations are difficult, peace agreement is difficult, a defeat of Russia invasion very difficult, the defeat of Ukrainian by the Russians will not be the end of it. So the only hope that these people have, Ukrainians especially, is that an anti-war movement will develop in both countries and stop the war. Many people will say this is very impossible, very difficult, close to impossible, but who knows? The existence of the anti-war movement in the United States was critical for the Vietnamese to win the war. If we have a peace movement developing in both countries with connecting each other, It is a hope far away, but still a hope that the war can be ended that way. Then is the what will be is our program. And here I'm toying with a number of slogans. Of course, these all have to be discussed and see how other Congress opinion is and how we develop it forward. First of all, not imperialist war against both NATO, UE, and Zelensky and the Russian invasion, for self-determination of Ukraine and Ukrainians and the Russian-speaking minority, because here is the self-determination of both that we have to defend. For revolutionary defeatism, turn the guns against your bourgeoisie for class war, which was the classical slogans of Lenin in the First World War. For a government of workers and oppressed nationalities, we have to work toward the unity of the Ukrainian people again. For the dissolution of NATO and the collective security treaty organization, which is the NATO of the Russian with the other allies in Eastern Europe, immediate ceasefire and a democratic plebiscite in the Ukrainian territories to determine the future and guarantee self-determination, organized by a parity commission of Ukrainians of all nationalities and guaranteed by no belligerent neutral parties. Need elaboration, it's not. This is a long slogan, but it's the idea. Reconstruction of Ukraine paid by Russia and Eastern Europe and the US under the control of the Democratic Commission elected in Ukraine, need more sought. An investigation of war crimes by all combatant forces by an impartial, neutral international commission. So that is my brief report for today. I'm also working on a longer article declaration with all the backup information to back up all these positions.